When I applied for this job, I had no idea that it would turn out to be either the best decision of my life or the worst nightmare I had ever faced. The company was prestigious, known for its professional environment and growth opportunities. It was the kind of place many of my friends dreamed of working at, and I felt incredibly lucky to be chosen. The first day, a dream come true. On my first day, everything seemed perfect. The office was well organized, modern, and filled with smart, ambitious people. I could already imagine myself thriving in this environment. That's when I met Mr. Adnan, the head of my department. I had heard about him before, highly respected, influential, and known for his leadership skills. When I shook hands with him, he held my gaze a little longer than expected and gave me a subtle smile. It felt like he was analysing me. The moment passed quickly and I brushed it off, assuming he was just a confident leader. Small, uncomfortable signs. The first week was intense. The workload was high, but I expected that. Mr. Adnan often stopped by my desk, offering help and words of encouragement. At first I appreciated it, but then I started noticing something unusual. He would say things that felt off. "You're very talented. I don't think I've ever seen a newcomer pick things up this fast. There's something unique about the way you talk. It's captivating. Smart and beautiful girls like you are rare. We're lucky to have you here." At first I took them as compliments, but over time his words started feeling more personal, less professional. I ignored my instincts, thinking I was overreacting. After all, he was my boss. Maybe he was just trying to make me feel comfortable. Overly personal conversations. As time went on, his questions became more personal. He started asking things that had nothing to do with work. "Are you single, or are you in a relationship? What kind of men do you like? What do you usually do after work?" These were not normal questions from a boss. I answered vaguely, trying not to offend him, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. Yet I convinced myself that he was just being friendly. Strange behaviour in meetings. One day Mr. Adnan called me to his office for a discussion about an important project. I walked in, expecting a professional meeting, but from the moment I stepped inside, something felt different. He got up from his chair to greet me, smiling in a way that felt too familiar. "You're truly an asset to the team," he said, motioning for me to sit. I smiled politely and thanked him, trying to focus on the project details. But then he added, "You know, your smile is very charming. It's the kind that can make anyone fall for you." I was taken aback. This was no longer about work. His tone, his expression, everything felt inappropriate. I forced a small laugh and tried to steer the conversation back to business. But something inside me had shifted. Feeling trapped. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a pattern. If I talked to other colleagues, especially male ones, Mr. Adnan would suddenly appear and find an excuse to interrupt. He started micromanaging my work, keeping me close under the pretense of guiding me. "I don't think you should work with anyone else. I understand your talent better. If you ever need anything, come to me directly. No need to involve others. I want to make sure you reach your full potential here, with my guidance." It was subtle, but the message was clear. He wanted control over me. The first major red flag one evening, he asked me to stay after hours. "We have an important presentation and I'd like to go over it with you privately," he said. I hesitated, but it was work-related, so I agreed. As the office emptied out, I felt an uneasy silence settling in. Mr. Adnan approached me with a casual smile. "I hope you don't mind staying late," he said. "I prefer working in a quiet setting without distractions." His words made my stomach twist. We started working, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me. He wasn't just looking at my work, he was watching me. Crossing the line as I typed, I felt him move closer, too close. I could smell his cologne, feel his presence hovering over my shoulder. "You work so hard," he murmured. "I admire that in a woman." I forced a polite smile and kept my focus on the screen. Then he did something that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. He reached out and lightly touched my hand. It was brief but deliberate, a slow, testing gesture. My entire body tensed. I quickly moved my hand away and pretended to adjust my watch, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. The moment of realization. At that moment, I knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't just a friendly boss. I realized that every uncomfortable compliment, every controlling action, every lingering stare, it had all been leading to this. I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't a professional relationship anymore. This was a trap. At first, everything seemed normal. My boss, Mr. Adnan, was professional, charming even, and well respected in the office. He carried himself with confidence, and I noticed how people admired his leadership. In the beginning, I thought I was lucky to have someone so experienced guiding me in my new role. But soon I started noticing small things that didn't seem alarming on their own, but when put together made me feel uneasy. It began with subtle compliments. At first, they were about my work. "You have a great eye for detail. That's rare in someone so young. Your reports are impressive. I think you're going to go far in this company." I appreciated the praise, but soon his words started to shift. The compliments became less about my work and more about me. "You have such a warm presence. It's refreshing to have someone like you here. That colour suits you. You should wear it more often." His tone was casual, but the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable. It wasn't how a boss should look at an employee. Then came the personal questions. At first they seemed innocent, questions about my hobbies, my weekend plans, but they quickly became more intrusive. "So do you live alone or with family? Are you seeing anyone? A girl like you must have a lot of admirers. What kind of men do you find attractive?" Each time I tried to answer vaguely, brushing them off with laughter or changing the subject. I told myself he was just being friendly. Maybe he was just one of those people who liked to connect with their employees on a personal level. But then came the comments disguised as jokes. "Be careful with that charming smile. You might break a few hearts around here. If I weren't your boss, I'd ask you out for dinner. Just kidding. Or am I? I didn't know how to react. Was I overthinking? Was I being too sensitive? He never said anything outright inappropriate, but it was the way he said it, the way he looked at me when he did. The worst part was that he never did it in front of anyone else. When other colleagues were around, he was nothing but professional. But when it was just the two of us, his words carried a different weight. I started dreading being alone in a room with him. Every meeting, every one-on-one discussion felt like I was walking on thin ice. I didn't want to offend him. I needed this job. But at the same time, I felt trapped. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that maybe I was over-analyzing his behavior. But soon, my boss, Mr. Adnan, made it impossible to ignore. It started with late-night messages. At first, they were strictly work-related. A quick request for a document, a follow-up on a meeting, but then they became more frequent and less professional. "Still awake? You work too hard? Or do you just like staying up late? Just saw something funny and thought of you. Want to see? It's nice having someone in the office I can actually talk to." I never knew how to respond. If I ignored him, would it seem rude? If I answered, would it encourage him? I started delaying my replies, hoping he'd get the hint. But he didn't. Then came the physical proximity. In meetings, he found unnecessary reasons to stand behind me, leaning over my shoulder to check my work. His presence felt suffocating. Whenever he spoke to me, he stood too close, his voice lower than necessary. If I stepped back, he stepped forward. It was a silent game I never wanted to play. Once, during a team meeting, he brushed his hand against mine as he passed a file. It could have been accidental, but then it happened again. And again. A touch here, a lingering moment there. The worst part? No one else noticed. Colleagues either didn't see what was happening or didn't care. If they did, they never said anything. When I subtly hinted about his behaviour to a co-worker, she simply shrugged. That's just how he is. He's harmless. Harmless, but it didn't feel harmless when I started dreading going to work, when I made excuses to avoid being alone in a room with him, when I stayed silent because I knew that if I spoke up, people would think I was overreacting. I felt trapped. I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad, that he hadn't done anything too inappropriate, that maybe I was just misunderstanding things. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. It was supposed to be just another routine meeting, a one-on-one discussion in my boss's office to go over a project. I had done this countless times before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way Mr. Adnan looked at me when he called me in, or the way my stomach twisted as I stepped into his office. The door clicked shut behind me. I took my usual seat across from him, placing my notebook on the table, ready to discuss the numbers. But he wasn't looking at the documents. He was looking at me. "You've been working really hard lately," he said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I notice everything, you know. You're not like the others. You're special." My fingers tightened around my pen. This wasn't about work anymore. He stood up and walked around his desk, moving closer. My heartbeat quickened as he placed a hand on the back of my chair, standing just behind me. "You deserve more than this office can give you," he murmured, his voice dangerously low. "I can help you if you trust me." Panic surged through me. I could feel the power he held, not just as my boss, but as someone who had control over my job, my future. I had worked too hard to let a single moment destroy everything, but what was I supposed to do? Call him out? Laugh it off? Pretend I didn't understand? I forced a small, nervous chuckle. "That's kind of you, sir, but His hand brushed against my shoulder. A small touch, one that could be dismissed as accidental. But it wasn't. It lingered for a second too long. I froze. My mind screamed at me to get up and leave, but my body wouldn't move. My instincts told me that making him angry could make things worse, so I swallowed my discomfort, shifted slightly, and forced a polite smile. I should get back to my desk. There's a lot of work to do. For a moment he didn't say anything, then slowly he straightened up and took a step back. "Of course," he said, his tone unreadable. "We'll talk later." I practically ran out of his office, my hands shaking as I returned to my desk. My mind raced, replaying every second of what had just happened. Had I overreacted? Had I imagined it? Or was this just the first step in something far worse? I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with tension so thick it was suffocating. Every time I walked into the office, I felt his eyes on me. Every time I spoke in a meeting, I wondered if he was waiting for me to slip up. But the worst part? He acted as if nothing had happened. "You're too sensitive," he laughed one day when I subtly pushed back on his inappropriate jokes. "You take things too seriously. Lighten up a little." I tried to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I had misunderstood everything. Maybe he hadn't meant anything by his words. Maybe I had overreacted. But deep down, I knew the truth. It started with small things. Emails that were once professional suddenly contained playful remarks. Late-night messages about work turned into comments about my appearance, subtle shifts in behaviour that made me question my own reality. Then came the gaslighting. "You're imagining things," he said when I avoided staying late in the office. "I treat all my employees the same way." But I had seen it. The way he leaned in too close. The way his compliments were laced with something unsettling. The way he seemed to enjoy the power he held over me. Soon the work pressure doubled. Reports that were once approved without issue were suddenly not good enough. Small mistakes were exaggerated. Deadlines became tighter. Every time I tried to push back, he would smirk and say, "I just thought you were more capable than this." I began questioning myself. Was I losing focus? Was I really not good enough? He made sure I felt trapped. "I fought to get you on this team," he reminded me one day when I hesitated to join him for a late meeting. "I see potential in you, but if you keep acting this way, others might start thinking you're not a team player." A threat wrapped in false concern. I couldn't just walk away. I needed this job, the stability, the career growth I had worked so hard for. He knew that, and he was using it against me. This wasn't just harassment, it was a game of control, and I was running out of moves. I knew I couldn't keep living in fear. Every day felt like a battle, and I was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. I had spent too long questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining things, but deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't normal. I needed proof. I started by documenting everything, every inappropriate remark, every message that crossed the line, every time he accidentally brushed too close or found an excuse to be alone with me. I wrote down dates, times, exact words, anything that could later serve as evidence. At first it felt strange. I wasn't the kind of person to accuse someone without reason. But the more I wrote, the more I realized just how often it happened, how calculated it all was. Then I took it a step further. I saved messages. Every email, every text that had an underlying tone of manipulation or coercion, I screenshotted them and stored them in a secure folder. Whenever he sent something that made me uncomfortable, I made sure I had a copy. Next, I secretly recorded conversations I knew I couldn't rely solely on my word against his. He was powerful, well-respected, and had a way of twisting reality to make himself seem innocent. If I ever decided to report him, I needed something concrete. The first time I hit the record button on my phone before a meeting, my hands trembled. What if I got caught? What if he saw through me? But then I reminded myself he wasn't afraid to cross the line, so why should I be afraid to protect myself? Every time he made an inappropriate comment, I subtly captured it. Every time he used work as an excuse to control me, I saved the proof. Still, the fear never left me. I was terrified that he would find out, that he would retaliate, that he would make my life even worse than it already was. But as the fear grew, so did something else, determination. I wasn't going to let him destroy me. I wasn't going to let him win. I didn't know exactly how I would escape yet, but I knew one thing for sure. When the time came, I would be ready. The moment had arrived. I had spent weeks preparing, gathering proof, and planning every possible outcome. My heart pounded as I sat in my office staring at my phone, where I had saved every inappropriate message, recorded every conversation that proved his guilt. Today, I would finally confront him, but I couldn't do it alone. I knew the risks. He was powerful, well-respected, and had managed to keep his behavior hidden for so long. But I wasn't the same frightened employee who had once hesitated to speak up. I had a plan and an ally. Setting the trap. I had carefully arranged a meeting with my boss under the pretense of discussing an important project. I knew him well enough to predict what he would do. He would lock the door, lean too close, and start with subtle manipulation before escalating his behavior. It had happened too many times before, but this time things would be different. Before the meeting, I had spoken to HR in confidence. I showed them the proof, messages that couldn't be misinterpreted, recordings that clearly exposed his inappropriate behavior, and detailed logs of every time he crossed the line. They were shocked. Some of them even looked guilty, realizing they had ignored past complaints from other employees. However, one HR member, Sarah, truly listened. She wasn't just sympathetic, she was furious. "He won't get away with this," she had promised. Sarah agreed to help me set up the confrontation. While I was in the meeting with him, she would be right outside with security and the company's legal advisor, ready to intervene. Everything was in place. Now all I had to do was stay calm and let him expose himself. The moment of truth. As expected, the moment I entered his office, he locked the door behind me. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to remain composed. This was exactly what I needed to happen. He leaned back in his chair, looking at me with that smug expression I had come to despise. "You've been working so hard lately," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "You deserve a little relaxation." I clenched my fists under the desk, my phone discreetly recording in my pocket. "I just want to discuss the project," I said, keeping my voice steady. He chuckled, standing up and walking around the desk until he was right behind me. "You're always so professional," he murmured. "But we both know there's more to our relationship than just work." I turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Is that what you think?" His smirk widened. "I don't think, I know." That was it. That was all I needed. I stood up abruptly, forcing him to take a step back. "You know what, sir? I think HR would love to hear about this conversation." His expression shifted from amusement to confusion, and then realization. "What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. Justice at last. The door opened and Sarah stepped in, followed by 2 security personnel and the company's legal advisor. My boss's face went pale. What is this?" he stammered. Sarah held up a folder. "Evidence." She turned to me. "Are you okay?" I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The legal advisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Reynolds, we have reviewed serious allegations against you, supported by strong evidence. Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending a full investigation." My boss's expression twisted into panic and rage. He turned to me, eyes blazing. "You set me up." I met his glare without fear. "Number, you did this to yourself." He opened his mouth to argue, but security stepped forward. "Sir, please come with us." For the first time, he looked small, powerless, defeated. As he was escorted out, Sarah placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing." I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The moment my boss was escorted out of the office, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of disbelief. Was it really over? Could someone like him, who had used his power so carelessly, finally face the consequences? Sarah, my HR ally, gave me a small smile. "Take a deep breath," she said. "You did the hard part. Now let the system do its job." I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. The evidence was solid. There was no way he could talk his way out of this. But deep down, I knew people like him always tried to fight back. The aftermath word spread fast. By lunchtime, whispers had turned into open discussions, and soon everyone in the office knew that Mr. Reynolds had been suspended. Some people looked shocked, others exchanged knowing glances, and a few even looked guilty, perhaps realizing they had ignored the warning signs for years. A colleague named Emily approached me hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, I admire you," she said. I had a similar experience, but I was too scared to say anything." I felt a lump in my throat. "You're not alone," I told her. "No one should have to go through this in silence." Her eyes filled with tears, but before she could say anything else, Sarah called me into her office. "Legal is reviewing everything," she informed me. "Given the evidence, they believe the company has grounds for immediate termination." I exhaled, finally. "But," she added, looking grim, "he's not taking this quietly." The counterattack. I tensed. "What do you mean?" Sarah pushed a printed email across the desk. "He's already threatening legal action. He claims you fabricated everything to ruin his career." I scoffed. "That's ridiculous. The messages, the recordings, none of it is fake." "I know," she said, "but that doesn't mean he won't fight it, and he's powerful." I swallowed hard. That was my biggest fear, that his influence could somehow protect him. "He's also reaching out to other employees," Sarah continued, "trying to get them to defend him. Some might take his side, either out of fear or loyalty." I clenched my fists. "So what happens now?" Sarah sighed. "We proceed carefully. We strengthen your case, but you need to be prepared. This isn't over yet." The chilling message. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated before opening the message. "You think you've won? This isn't over. You'll regret this." A chill ran down my spine. It was him. I immediately blocked the number and took a deep breath. Fear was exactly what he wanted. I refused to give it to him. This battle wasn't over, but neither was I.